Good morning. I think this thing is working now. How do I see if I'm live? Oh, there we go. Why don't I have... Where's my little person down in the corner? Shoot. I'm sorry, folks. Where's my... Hold on, folks. I'm having some technical difficulties this morning. I swear I tested this all out a while ago, but really doesn't seem to be working, which is lots of fun. Oh, there I am. There I am. There I am. There I am. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, close that out. Oh, no, excuse. Minimize that. And open the slideshow. And what does that look like? What does that look like? Perfect. Perfect, 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 perfect. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Good morning. I see there are 6 people watching. If you're watching, say hi in the chat. Welcome to the first day of Corona Community College, as it were. We are meeting here for Political Science 101. Sorry this lecture is going up a little late this week. I honestly had to go buy a webcam and microphone today. Or not today, excuse me. On Tuesday, and Walmart was crazy, and of course there was no toilet paper, so we're doing the best we can. But if you are watching, go ahead and say hi. Now let me know you're out there. And we're going to get started talking about the media, picking up right where we left off. Let's see, which was talking about radio. So remember when we last met on campus, I was talking about the transition between different media technologies. First, we covered newspapers and how newspapers have changed over time with wire services and things like that. Next, we talked about commercial radio stations and how radio was the first technology that allowed politicians such as President Franklin Roosevelt to directly talk to the American public without any sort of mediation or anything like that. And I just realized I do not need these, so that's a lot more comfortable. And that brings us to, obviously, the media technology that was dominant in the United States for a good, 40, 50, 60 years, and is still a major player in our media today. That is, of course, television. Right? Television burst onto the American scene in the 1950s, and has one of the quickest technology adoption curves of any technology in history. America went TV buying crazy throughout the course of the 1950s and 60s, so that by the early 60s, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of American households had access to a television. And that really changed the way that people communicate or people consume media. No longer was it just auditory, it became visual. And as we've talked about before, during movements like the civil rights movement, that visual medium becomes enormously important because actually people can see what's happening in, to the freedom riders and during the Montgomery boycott being beamed right into their homes, which is a lot more impactful than just reading about it in the newspapers. Um, so Quite famously, in 1960 was the first televised presidential debate, and this is more evidence that television actually causes people to consume and interpret media differently. So the debate is between or hi Betty, the debate is between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, and there was a marked divide when pollsters surveyed people afterwards, because they always survey people and ask, who won the debate, who do you think was more competent, all that good stuff. So when they surveyed people after this debate, one of the questions that they asked them was, did you listen to it on the radio or did you watch it on television? And what they found was that there was a major difference in terms of individuals' perceptions of the debate. You know what? I'm looking down here, and I'm going to make my little self smaller so that you can see the whole slide, just real quick like. But there was some significant differences in the perception of the debate there, depending on how it was that people consumed that debate, whether they listened to it on the radio or whether they watched it on television. This changed the way that people evaluate and interpret presidential candidates, because if you listen to it on the radio, people generally said that Richard Nixon sounded like he was better prepared, more knowledgeable, had better policies, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you watched the debate on television, you probably thought that JFK looked more presidential. He was more competent, he was just more charming and attractive, and Richard Nixon looked, quite honestly, like a sweating, filthy liar, which, he is, but anyway, so this is going to be hard. I don't know when my jokes land. You can throw me an LOL in there if you're feeling charitable. Anyway, so people overwhelmingly thought Nixon won the debate if they heard it on the radio, and they thought Kennedy won the debate if they saw it on television. So this completely changed the way people evaluate presidential candidates. They started asking questions like, does this person look presidential? Do they have the bearing of somebody who can lead our country? Or, as we'll talk about later on, does he look like someone I can have a beer with? Which was a really common question during the Bush-Gore presidential election. I promise you it was a thing. It sounds crazy, but it was totally a thing. So, really, television was also an amazingly homogeneous period in our media consumption. Broadcast television was dominated by just a couple of networks, NBC and CBS, with ABC as a later kind of also ran. But two networks monopolized the TV news business from the 1960s and 70s, and it is hard to overstate, and it's hard to imagine in our world of, always on media and instantaneous video conferencing, and thank God for all that, because we're all trapped in our homes. Everything is fine. I'm doing great. Anyway, back then, you really only had 3 TV channels. Unless you lived in the biggest of cities, you really only had 3 TV channels: ABC, NBC, CBS, and that was it. And all 3 of those TV channels aired news at the 6 p.m. hour. Local news followed by world news. And so if you were watching TV around the dinner table, which happened reasonably often, or more likely you had taken your dinner into the living room and sat on the couch to eat it, to watch TV. But if you were watching TV during dinner, you were watching the news. You had no choice. And it's also remarkable, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, the way that present or the way that media regulations in the United States led to those three television networks having a very, very similar editorial point of view. So really from everybody was watching television from the 1950s through roughly the 1980s got the same news. And if we look back at our politics, we see a politics that was not nearly as partisan, not nearly as polarized. And we certainly see an environment where there still existed some nonpartisan gatekeepers, especially in the media, as to what is truth, what is fact, and things like that, which I don't know if you all have noticed, but that sort of thing has significantly broken down lately. Oh, hold on a second. Let me get this light on, because... There we go. A little more light for everybody to see my lovely self by. Anyway, so technology started changing the monopoly. Cable TV is actually not a terribly new technology. It debuted right alongside television itself back in the mid-1950s. Cable TV originated when... so there was this town, right? Outside of, I think it was Chicago, and this town is on the other side of a low ridge from Chicago. And the local appliance store owner, he got into the television craze really early. He starts getting TVs into his shop. He wants to sell them to people, and the first couple of people buy TVs, and they put them in their house, and they put up an antenna, and they can't see anything because there's this row of hills separating them from the TV transmitters in Chicago. So this enterprising appliance store owner actually invents cable television. He goes up on the hill, he puts a big ol' antenna up on the top of this hill, he points it at Chicago, and puts in some big ol' amplifiers, some real heavy-duty, sturdy cable, and lays a cable line from the top of that hill down into town. And he would charge people a monthly fee to connect to that line, and then they could start watching television. So he actually got it on. He got a cut of the cable TV after he sold the TV. It was a very, very good business move for him. But he invents cable TV, and this is in like 1954, 1955. But the development of ancillary television technologies like satellite feeds and relays and things like that really did change the ability of television stations to deliver their content pretty much everywhere. Prior to this time, you really would have had a tape delay on any television shows that were not produced in your local area. Actually, I recall a documentary about the sitcom I Love Lucy, and part of the contract negotiations that they had over starting the Lucy show and moving from what was a radio show to a television show was about where they would shoot the show, because Lucy and Desi wanted to live in Hollywood, but the biggest TV market was in New York, and if they shot the show in Hollywood, they would have to show tapes to the New York audience, which were of much lower quality at the time than live television. But as technology changed, as we got better and better at moving video from one place to another with microwaves, with satellites, you started seeing TV stations become cable TV only, right? You started seeing the launch of television stations that only existed on cable TV. You also started seeing the rise of what were called superstations like TBS and WGN, which were just local television stations which leveraged their position in the local TV market to get onto cable and become major content providers. So technology broke this, ABC, NBC, CBS, clunk, 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 TV monopoly. And cable stations started popping up in the 1970s, including one that was heralded as extraordinarily innovative at the time, which played only music videos. Here in 1978, MTV goes on the air. Video killed the radio star. And now MTV doesn't play music videos anymore, and so they have like 6 other channels to do that. More importantly for politics, though, is that the rise of CNN in the 1980s, a television station that did nothing but cover the news. Nothing but news 24/7, 365. And that created the 24-hour news cycle. And CNN was really a minor player in the whole news media up until 1991, which is when CNN was able to show live video via satellite of American cruise missiles landing in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. And that really kind of leveraged the new network's credibility to new heights. CNN became a major player in the news and is now available pretty much everywhere in the world. Hold on just a second. I have to let my cat out of the bathroom. For the curious, I have a bunch of very old cats, and one of them doesn't do dry food anymore, but one of them throws up when he eats wet food, so I have to feed the other one in the bathroom, and you want to let out. Anyway, so cat released, on with the 24-hour news cycle, right? So CNN starts showing news 24/7, 365, and I'm just wondering how many of you out there have watched CNN for any length of time, if you've been like stuck in an airport, or maybe you're just a news junkie. I remember during 9/11, people were just kind of like glued to the news. Actually, it wouldn't surprise me if people are just staring at CNN all day in the middle of their quarantine, although I strongly recommend that you don't do that. But anyway, my point is that if you sit there and watch CNN all day, you start to notice that it repeats. You get the news in about a 20-minute loop, and then the cycle repeats over again, and the cycle repeats over again, and that is not engaging for maintaining viewership. So one thing they've done is they've gone to having, talk shows and things like that at prime time. But the other thing is that they just desperately seek out news stories to put into what I previously mentioned the industry calls the news hole. So the news media is constantly out there, constantly looking for stories, and they're going to drum up and, chat up and talk up whatever they can find in order to try and make it look persuasive and compelling and get y'all to tune your eyeballs into their TV. I guess my TV's over here. You can't see that. And that makes for a media that is hungry for any little piece of drama, any little exclusive scoop that they can get, and makes for a media that, quite frankly, overblows some of the things that it finds. The biggest instance that I remember of this was when Rachel Maddow said that she got a hold of Trump's tax returns. And obviously this is a big issue during the 2016 election, that Trump wouldn't release his tax returns. God, it seems so petty now that we were worried about tax returns and not, whether or not this guy would be competent in the midst of a national emergency, which obviously no. So she built this thing up. They had ads playing on MSNBC and on my Facebook feed and everywhere for, it was like 2 weeks. finally tune in. She got me to tune in, and I'm pissed off about that because I finally tune in, and it is like one page of like the front side of like a 1996 1040 forum. It was so meaningless. It told us absolutely nothing about the state of the presidential race and the core questions about which we are asking when we are asking about Trump's tax returns and things like that. But because they have this 24-hour news cycle to fill, they will pounce on half of a 1040 forum from 30 years ago. So that news cycle today never ever ends, right? Which is a point so important that it looks like your textbook authors wanted to highlight it twice. So the line, next thing I want to talk about, though, is the rise of infotainment. Infotainment is the blending of news media and entertainment. So if you look on television, if you watch any of these news shows at prime time, you'll note they all try to be a little witty and a little funny and a little entertaining, right? You'll also note that politics often happens on shows that are labeled as entertainment. John McCain announced his presidential campaign on The Late Show with David Letterman, right? Stephen Colbert regularly comments on politics and has big-time political guests on his show on late night, right? We can even talk about shows like The Old Colbert Report, if anyone remembers that, or The Daily Show, where they were explicitly blending the line between news and entertainment. And I'm not saying that The Daily Show wasn't extraordinarily informative, isn't still extraordinarily informative, although, to be honest, I haven't watched it since Jon Stewart left, and there's a lot of people along with me. I do watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which is another one of these infotainment shows, right? John Oliver is not a journalist, he's a comedian. And it pains me to say that because I think he does great journalism. But fundamentally, the point of Last Week Tonight is to be informative, but to be entertaining, to be funny, to make you laugh at the right beats. And that can be problematic because social scientists, political psychologists have shown. Hold on just a moment. I promise y'all it's allergies. Anyway, social scientists have shown that when you're laughing at something, you are less critical of it. When you're laughing at something, you're less likely to question it, right? Humor is a tool for political manipulation. And furthermore, entertainment shows are less likely to be heavily critical of politicians. When John McCain went on David Letterman, when he announced his presidential campaign there, do you think that Letterman asked the same sort of hard-hitting questions that, like, I don't know, a Rachel Maddow would have asked or something like that? No, he's being conversational, he's being friendly, he's being humorous. Because that's what late night entertainment is about. Sorry. Anyway, so we have blurred this line between news and entertainment. News shows try to be entertaining shows try to show you the news, and it's not that these shows aren't informative. In fact, one of my favorite political science studies of all time showed that viewers of The Daily Show and The Colbert Report back in the early 2000s in their heyday were actually better informed than viewers of Fox News. So, it's not that these shows don't inform, they do. But they don't necessarily do it in the same critical journalistic way, and they don't necessarily get evaluated in the same way as straight news, as it would be. So this is a trend that has been accelerating with our diversifying media because hey, everybody wants to be entertained, right? And so all these media outlets out there, both on the air and online, and politicians are trying to curry favor with all of them, and so we definitely see further and further blending of this line between informative and entertaining programming. Let's see. That's about media bias, so we'll come back to that. Let's talk about the new media, right? So we do live in a time when media sources are diversifying in an extraordinary way. We have 500 channels on cable and still nothing to watch. We have all of these streaming services, which for the record I think should be free during this national emergency. I'm sorry if we all have to stay home. Y'all should pay for our Netflix. But we have all these streaming services. We can get news at the drop of a hat. And it's not that hard to get just dozens and dozens and dozens of different viewpoints, different perspectives, different sorts of presentations on the news. But a lot of those sources offer more commentary than they offer original reporting. The vast majority of basic shoe leather, walking the beat, going and taking interviews and asking questions and taking pictures, that sort of stuff is still overwhelmingly done. Thank you, Betty. That stuff is still overwhelmingly done by traditional media reporters, by employees of newspapers, television stations, and the like. There are some new media outlets out there that do original reporting, but they're often underfunded and undersubscribed. This includes one of my personal favorite media outlets for local Nevada news, which is called the Nevada Independent. They're a nonprofit news media source. They're online, nevadaindependent.com, and if you want to know what's going on in local politics, I do recommend you look there. But they are funded by the contributions of basically Nevada's political elite. You notice whenever they talk about politicians, it's like, oh, hey, Steve Sisolak gave us $2,500, and, Dean Heller gave us $800, and stuff like that. And it's usually people on the left, but they do a lot of great reporting, and they are underfunded because, ad space on websites only pays for so much. And that means important stories might get lost, right? Furthermore, if people don't even know that they exist, if it's only a political insider thing, then yeah, important stories might not get transmitted out to the general public. And furthermore, traditional media tend to include a variety of viewpoints. It is not that hard for users of the new media to inhabit an echo chamber, as they call it. And we all do it. We all do it. I admit, I mostly watch news sources that agree with me. Why? Because I'm not getting paid to get annoyed at the hosts on Fox News, right? It's just not something I want to deal with. By the way, are the audio levels okay for everybody? But yeah, so I'm not getting paid to listen to stuff that I disagree with, because it upsets me. It makes me angry. I don't like it, right? And so it's very easy for thank you. It's very easy for folks to inhabit an echo chamber where they don't ever encounter news viewpoints that are other than theirs. Whereas in the past, the New York Times editorial page has a policy where they publish a whole bunch of different viewpoints. That's what they do. It's um, part of their policy because they want viewers to be exposed to, particular um, corners of the political spectrum. Of course, that also came with a certain amount of gatekeeping, right? It also came with, the New York Times editorial page basically being the arbiters of what is acceptable politics, right? Uh, they would publish people from the center left and the center right, but never from like the democratic socialist left, never from the like xenophobic anti-immigrant right? And so having those news media sources between uh, between politicians and users would allow for the filtering of these views to a certain extent. Right? And so if people still got their news media from those same 3 TV channels in the 1950s, it would be very hard to imagine the rise of a candidate like Donald Trump, or for that matter, Bernie Sanders, right? Both of whom have relied on social media and partisan media to advance their causes. Awesome. So, furthermore, as I talked about before, new media is ripe for fake news. Fake news are news stories that are either once straight out made up, and there were a whole bunch of these during the 2016 election of news stories that were just flat out bullshit, 100% made up. News stories that are flat out made up, or news stories that you may have seen these out there on the interwebs that are kinda true, but they take one little line in a news release or a law or something like that, and they blow it dramatically out of proportion, right? As an example of this, during the 2012 election, President Obama said something along the lines of, if you're a business owner and you went out and you got your business done and you're doing well and you're doing successful and you built your business, that's great. But you got to realize that the roads that get your product to your business and get your customers to your door, well, you didn't build that, right? The telecom networks that you rely on every day, you didn't build that. And so he was making this case to say that society had a greater role in individuals' success than individuals necessarily wanted to admit. But the way it got played in the conservative media is that Obama's saying business owners didn't actually build their businesses. And you didn't build that became this epithet in the middle of the campaign, where it was just like, Obama doesn't think that business people work for a living. And that's obviously a total misrepresentation, and probably an example of these stories that are not made up per se, but that are definitely skewed, slanted, twisted to promote a particular viewpoint. And that's not the most egregious example. That's just one that made its way into the mainstream news. And fake news is on the rise. Make no mistake about it. Fake news is a growing part of our media ecosystem. It is more common on the right than on the left. It's more common to see fake news on the conservative side of politics than on the liberal side. But that doesn't mean that it's exclusive to one side or the other. I found particularly that like the anti-GMO, all-natural wellness communities have a tendency to share complete gibberish as well from time to time. And so that's and they tend to be politically on the left. So for the most part, fake news is also a phenomenon concentrated among older adults. It really is your 65-year-old Fox News watching conservative uncle who is sharing this stuff. Everybody, meet Naomi. Say hi, Naomi. Hi. Uh, and so fake news is on the rise and is becoming harder to detect because if you're not in that echo chamber, if you are not getting the conservative news, then you don't honestly see the crazy things that are going around in there. I mean, right now it is serious. Seriously, there are memes going around. Everybody's saying that this whole coronavirus thing is a Democratic plot. It's a hoax. It's a way for those damn libs to get government more in our lives. And I'm like, you know, if you guys like, they're seriously talking about how people on the political right are not isolating themselves, and people on the political left are. And this may actually be an ideologically selective plague, which is absolutely incredible. But that shows you the power of these media echo chambers, right? Obviously, this is a serious thing. All traditional disease control organizations all over the world are saying this is a serious thing. A whole bunch of dead Italians and Chinese folks, and Iranians too, we often forget about that, are saying this is a serious thing. But fake news floating around the conservative echo chamber says, go out to the bars, have a good time. Right? Don't worry about it. Although good luck with that, because all restaurants and bars are, by the way, closed for the next month. You can still get delivery or takeout, but you can't eat in. So the new media also allows for, as we are seeing right now, citizen participation, right? It's very easy for me to broadcast this feed out to all of you over the internet. I've got, the number watching keeps going up and down and up and down. But I had 16 at one point. I'm down to 12. I'm sorry I'm not that engaging. But I'm able to talk out to, well, all 90 of you if you're all tuning in. And you are able to talk back to me. And I've got my little laptop under here. And I can chat back at you, which is really cool. Thank you. And that kind of participation is enabled by our technology, right? I talked before about how these things are really changing our news media, have changing our politics. And Black Lives Matter is the best example of that. We've had a number of incidents over the years. I mean, the list of names goes on and on. Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Philando Castile. I can keep going for a while, unfortunately. And so we really do have we've had a number of these police killings of young black men who were posing no threat to the police officer. Many of them were shot in the back. Many times it was over something as simple as a traffic stop. And none of these events are new. Like this sort of thing has been happening in America, since the time of Jim Crow. It's sad to say. What is new is that people are now able to, when they see a police officer reach for his gun around an unarmed black teenager, they're able to pull out their smartphone and go, boink, film it, upload it straight to Facebook, and now all of a sudden it's national news, right? The shootings aren't new. The camera phones are. The camera phones have enabled people who are often from very poor, very downtrodden neighborhoods and backgrounds to fight back against the media blackout surrounding, racist policing. And it has very much changed the conversation around policing and criminal justice in the United States, to the point that in 2020 now, even Republicans are saying that, we need to be reforming our criminal justice system. We need to be, diverting more people from prison, and we need to be, cutting back on punitive sentencing and things like that. Even mainstream Republicans are saying that. Not the Trumpy Republicans. They're saying lock them all up, but mainstream Republicans are saying, hey, we need to reform our criminal justice system. And let me tell you, as somebody who lived through the tough on crime 90s, it's hard to overstate how nuts everything was about crime and the drug war, and how many politicians ran how many bad political ads promising to lock up tens, hundreds, thousands of low level offenders so that they could get the crime problem under control. um, and so the fact that we're now talking about major criminal justice reform on the political right is actually really incredible. Right? Um, there's also the fact that it's a lot easier to track what has happened on one of these things than back on the old school telephones. Back in the day, if you made a phone call, nobody made a record of it except the phone company to bill you. Nobody recorded it or anything. And so when everything was kind of done over, audible phone calls, it was a lot easier for politicians to hide things. Now everything is done over text. And so we have everything is done over text, everything is done over email. And so we have seen time and time and time again politicians getting caught. They got caught. Somebody finds their texts, their emails that prove that they were doing something scandalous, right? The 2016 elections partially turned over the issue of the DNC email hack, and how Debbie Wasserman Schultz was corresponding with her staffers in ways that made it look like she was really, really trying to make sure that Bernie Sanders did not win the Democratic primary. And that got her kicked out of the Democratic National Committee. After which she immediately took a job with Hillary's campaign. Wonder how that worked. But so those sorts of little trace events, little emails, text messages, Facebook posts. How many times has Cheeto Mussolini gotten in trouble for a tweet? How many times have you seen politicians get in trouble for a tweet and then delete it? Right? That those sorts of trace events can now very much get politicians into trouble these days. That's a new phenomenon, right? So this is folks who are concerned about fake news, right? You can see that a lot of people are really worried about this stuff, right? 67% of news consumers are concerned that there are stories where facts are twisted to push an agenda. 65% are concerned about stories that are completely made up, right? 60% concerned about poor journalism. 48%, this is something we should all be concerned about the use of the term fake news to discredit the news media, right? Headlines that look like news but turn out to be ads, right? And online news consumers are also concerned, by the way, about the prevalence of satire. Pardon. Sorry, this is all getting all tangled up over here. Oh my god. But concerned about the presence of satire, and I mean, I'm even guilty of Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Allergy meds. Lovely having seasonal allergies at a time when a cough could actually kill you. Um, but anyway, uh, don't worry about it, Rachel. Uh, it is okay. This will all be recorded and it will be put up later. So if any of y'all have friends who are out there who aren't tuning in right now, it is okay. This will all be recorded. It will be put up later, and so everybody will have the chance to see me, sneezing, all together. So, yeah, it'll all be archived. So if you can't make it, you can't make it. That is okay. Anyway, so satire. That's where I was. Even I've gotten in trouble sharing satirical articles. As if they were real news media. Because honestly, in today's world, it is hard to tell. It is hard to tell what is the Onion and what is actually, the news that's going on in our politics. We have a strange world that we live in. We live under the Trump administration. Who saw that coming? And as of right now, America is canceled. So, I mean, who saw that coming? We live in crazy, crazy times. Times when, for example, politicians feel free to say things that would have gotten them disqualified from office in earlier days. So it is kind of crazy. What actually ends up in the news these days, and how hard it can be to distinguish from deliberate satire. So is the media biased? Well, yes, but not the way you think. So let's scroll back here. This is among Americans who believe each news source to be unbiased and objective. You can see we've got Fox actually leading that track. Not because of any particular lack of bias, but because its viewers are extraordinarily dedicated. 60% of Republicans believe that Fox News is objective and unbiased. Only 3% of Democrats believe that. 0 Republicans believe that MSNBC is objective. 1% believe that NPR is. 4% believe that CNN is. You can see how much the Trump administration has shattered conservative trust in our media. On the Democratic side, no single form of media is dominant. But you can also see the partisan divide in accusations of media bias, right? What do we hear over and over and over again in our politics? That lion liberal media, right? Conservatives are much more likely to attack the news media for being liberally biased than liberals are to attack it for being conservatively biased. We'll come back to local news here in a bit, because that's actually an important thing. But so you see that many Americans are concerned about media bias in general. I mean, look at these percentages overall. There is no media source that America actually agrees on these days, like it did in the days of the clunk, clunk, clunk 3 TV channels, right? And that is a problem, because when the public no longer trusts media organizations, our governing system suffers. Media is essential for our democracy. If we don't have a functioning free press, it's very, very difficult for our democracy to function, right? When the public no longer trusts media organizations, the U.S. government suffers, and I think we are seeing that, right? We live in a world where there is no objective and trustworthy media source trusted by most Americans, and facts have become partisan, right? Like I just mentioned. The fact of whether or not you're going to die from the 2020 flu is now a partisan issue, right? Democrats are staying in their homes. Hi. And Republicans are going out and partying. I don't know what impact that's going to have on the elections, but it cannot be good for Trump's chances. Now, there are some ways in which the accusations of liberal bias are plausible. Media reporters are less likely to identify as Republicans than the national population. Do I have that chart? No, I don't have that chart. There is a chart in your book on which party reporters identify with. But there is a chart on here that partially explains that problem. You see, most of our media jobs, where are they? They're in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C. They're concentrated in places that are, as you can see, solidly Democratic and becoming more so. So it's not unsurprising that reporters who are influenced, remember from chapter 7, are influenced by their friends, their peers, their communities, that reporters are a little more Democratic on average than the national public. Because, well, actually a lot more Democratic on average than the national public, because they live in environments that are significantly more Democratic on average than the national public. Nam, you're in the shot. You're in the shot, kitty. Everybody say hi to Naomi again. She's so cute. So yeah, media jobs are clustered in Democratic counties, so it's no surprise that reporters are Democrats. But in a larger sense, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of studies who have attempted to determine whether or not the media is biased in favor of Democrats against Republicans, and so far we have not seen that. We have not seen a situation where media is systemically biased towards one party or another. Okay, you can get off. Bite me. So obviously certain media outlets are, right? MSNBC definitely leans a little more to the, well, center left, right? You know, kind of that Biden Clinton Democrat perspective. Fox News is catering to the whims of the unhinged conservative id right now. Some individual media sources obviously have their own particular slant, but the media as a whole fails to show a systemic bias in the issues that it covers. In fact, the media, because of years and years and years of being accused of conservative bias, is often very sensitive to these concerns and sometimes even is over-deferential to conservative interpretations of things. Like, for example, Benghazi, which was a non-story, but which dominated the media for at least 6 months there. Sometimes the media is over-concerned about conservative concerns because of this concern about media bias, right? So sometimes they actually overstep in the other direction. You see people arguing about it from the left, right? That's not to say, though, that the media are not biased at all, just because they don't seem to have any systemic partisan bias. There is a deeper bias that runs through the news media, and it is the almighty dollar. Media in the United States are for profit. And the dominant paradigm for funding our media is to fund media through advertising. I've said it before in class, mostly about social media, but it's true of all media. If you are not paying for it, you are not the consumer, you are the product, right? The bias that runs through our news media, the commercial bias that runs through our news media, is extensive. Media needs to attract a larger audience. Media needs to attract a larger audience because the audience is the product that they sell to their advertisers. You're not the consumer, you're the product, right? Getting you to read the news on somebody's website means that you are exposed to the ads on that website, unless you're like me and you use ad blocker. Um, there's a browser called Brave that is basically Google Chrome but with ad blocker built in. Strongly recommend. Um, but media sells its audience to advertisers. Media has to attract eyeballs. The prime directive, not primer directive, but prime directive for media outlets is to grow their audience, right? Higher ratings, more circulation, more subscribers, right? Is always the demand of media outlets in our society. We have a for-profit capitalist media. Market forces the market forces each news source towards the politics of its audience. So if you have a newspaper in, Birmingham, Alabama, that is, really, really pro Bernie Sanders and is like, progressive democratic socialist, and they're probably not going to get a whole lot of subscribers. They're probably not going to get a whole lot of people subscribing to that newspaper in Alabama. They'll get some, but their advertisers are always going to be drawn to whoever gets the most eyeballs. And, the progressive socialist, Birmingham, Alabama Free Press is probably never going to be the. I made that up. There is no such thing. But that hypothetical newspaper is never going to be the most profitable. So either that newspaper is going to hew closer to the conservative viewpoint of its audience, or some other newspaper will, and they will outcompete the lefty paper, right? Market forces force news sources towards the politics of their audience. Conservative audiences get conservative news, liberal audiences get liberal news. Furthermore, though, even the kinds of stories that are covered are influenced by this need to get audiences, right? Drama delivers audiences. Why aren't hundreds of people tuning into my live stream right now? Well, because nobody knows who the hell I am, and because, it's not all that exciting to sit here and listen to me talk about politics. Drama, conflict, drives narratives and delivers audiences. Anyone out there who is a writer, right? You need a central conflict to drive your writing, right? So news stories often take on the appearance of narratives, right? You get a good guy and a bad guy, a protagonist and a villain, right? You have some sort of pathos, some sort of emotional connection to the story. There's some sort of central conflict, and then it ends, and there's a take-home message, right? That's how we cover a lot of politics. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are in conflict with one another over this election, and there is this drama of who's more corrupt, and one side says we really shouldn't be calling the entire population of Mexico a bunch of rapists and drug dealers, and the other side says but her emails, and it ends. And when Trump wins, the take-home message is that the Democrats need to attract the working-class white voter back into the fold, right? That's the media narrative. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. Obviously, all of this is more complicated than that. But this need to force everything into these pleasing narrative arcs can lead to a media in which we don't investigate and we don't seriously delve into the deeper substance of what's going on in our news. Let's see. An example of how this plays out is, in local television news, the rule has long been, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so think back to the last time you watched your local TV news. The top story was probably car crash, a murder, an assault, um, some grisly accident. Why? Because that draws audiences, right? That draws audiences in. If it bleeds, it leads, because people tune in to watch, you know, what is this big, scary, impactful thing that happened. That draws audiences in. It's also why you get these commercials for local news. What you don't know about your washing machine could kill you. More at 11, right? Because that brings people in. A lot of news reporting, because of this bias, though, lends itself towards making people very fearful, right? Um, Obviously, we live in a time where a lot of that fear is kind of justified right now, but uh, panic buying all the toilet paper really isn't, because I'm down to my last roll and I'm gonna have to go out later and see if I can find anywhere. So fingers crossed there. Um, but yeah, if it bleeds, it leads. Our perceptions of crime are totally skewed by this bias. You would not know it talking to members of the older generation. Like, if I asked my mother if it was safer for her to grow, if it was safer for her to grow up in the 1970s or for a child to grow up today, I guarantee you she would say it was safer for her to grow up in the 1970s. But if you look at the data, if you look at numbers about violent crime, property crime, kidnappings, all that good stuff, if you look at the data, we are actually living right now in one of the safest eras in American history. One of the safest eras in world history, period, since we've started collecting data. You would not know that, though, from the news media, because, again, the first thing that leads that news story is always going to be something grisly and bloody. And that leads to a society where, um, children allowed to play outside unsupervised get picked up by the police and their parents get cited for child endangerment. Where that, I mean, people used to let their kids walk all over town. It's unjustified, it's fearful, and it's because of media bias. We also see the investigative bias, right? Okay. So back in the day, media insiders really saw themselves as kind of part of the club, you know? Members of Congress and reporters had very cozy relationships. It was very much kind of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing. And that persisted for I mean, most of the American Republic up until about the middle of the 20th century. You saw a series of events that really started transforming the press's reaction towards members of the political establishment. You saw the civil rights movement. You saw how the press were manipulated during the Vietnam War. How the Johnson administration basically lied the nation into war. And most significantly, you saw the Watergate scandal. Now, most people, when I give this lecture, don't actually know what the Watergate scandal is. So, just going to talk about it really briefly here while I catch up my notes. The Watergate scandal was a scandal where Richard Nixon ordered some of his operatives to break into an office of the Democratic National Committee in an office complex right along the Potomac River in Alexandria, Virginia, right across from D.C. The office complex was called Watergate, which is why it's the Watergate scandal. Anyway, so these Nixon operatives, they broke into this office building. They broke into the Democratic National Committee, and they stole a bunch of documents relating to the Democratic Party's election strategy in the upcoming election, which ended up being between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. As Nixon ended up resigning. But so they stole a bunch of documents relating to strategy in that next election. And they got caught. Some night security guard at the Watergate in Alexandria saw some people wandering around in the DNC's office in the middle of the night with flashlights, called the cops, and these president's men were arrested on trespassing, breaking and entering charges. And the Nixon administration stepped in to get them out, stepped in to get their charges dropped and all that good stuff, because obviously they were doing what Nixon wanted them to do. And then he lied about it, right? Said this never happened. It spiraled out of control and eventually led to the president's resignation. But the media was basically like, hey, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. You're not going to get me again. So Watergate really was kind of the final straw in that cozy insider relationship between reporters and politicians. Do I have any questions on media bias so far? I'm going to hold a second so people can type. Okay. So I don't see any questions. Everyone out there doing okay? Can I get a thumbs up? All right, well, let's move on then into thumbs up. You can just say like K or something, that's fine. Move on to how governments shape the media. Also, I'm sorry, y'all, I had a really cool PowerPoint presentation template going on. I don't know how I pulled it up, so hopefully next time I'll figure that out. Whoop, thank you. So how governments shape the media. Media around the world is much more publicly owned than the media here in the United States. Most places around the world, you see public ownership of the media, where media outlets are run by the government, paid for with tax dollars, right? If you own a TV in the UK, you're required to pay, it's something like $100 a year in taxes on that TV in order to fund the British Broadcasting Company. In other places, government can regulate the media to ensure that it operates in the public interest. And most countries around the world that don't have a strongly publicly owned media definitely do a lot of this. The United States used to do a lot more of this. And then finally, government can stand aside and let the market guide the media. These are kind of the three different models, right? And this last one is mostly how the United States organizes our media. The assumption is that private companies will give the people what they want. Because if they don't, they'll go out of business, right? The free market will decide everything. And so we have a very strongly commercial media here in the United States. We'll talk more about public media ownership when we get a little further down the line. First, let's talk about print media. If you are a print media outlet in the United States, it is exceedingly difficult to stop you from printing whatever it is that you want. The First Amendment protects the print media from regulation. The Supreme Court has been strict about preventing government interference with the print media. So it is difficult to censor news. We talked before about in Chapter 5 about the case of the Pentagon Papers, when The New York Times went to publish a bunch of information about the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration didn't want them to. The Supreme Court slapped it down inside of 3 days. So difficult to censor the print media. It's also difficult to convict somebody of slander or libel. It's also, under the First Amendment, very difficult to prohibit things like hate speech. There's a case called Near v. Minnesota, which is about an anti-Semitic newspaper in Minneapolis. And the court basically found the First Amendment gives you the right to be a bigot. It's unfortunate, but it is the consequence of our society's, of our Constitution's extraordinarily strong stance against censorship and towards freedom of the press. We also see journalistic traditions that help shape these norms. Reporters are known to protect their sources. You can actually say something to a reporter, off the record or on background, and typically people will not divulge where they got their information from. It allows reporters to go in and report on things that aren't necessarily entirely legal, right? It allows reporters to get access to places that they might not otherwise have access. But it also means that reporters are often pressured by law enforcement, by governments, to give up their sources, to talk about where they got their information, and in doing so, expose those people to prosecution, expose those people to risk. And reporters, generally speaking, will not do that. Sometimes to the point of going to jail over it. There was a famous incident where a New York Times reporter, Julia Miller, went to jail on contempt of court charges back during the Bush administration. So this may be a little too long ago for some of y'all to remember. But back during the Bush administration, this person was ordered to overturn the name of one of her sources, and she didn't want to do that because one of her sources was a CIA operative undercover overseas. And the court ordered her to do it, and she said no. So she actually spent a few days in jail over that one, until somebody else revealed the identity of this CIA operative, a lady by the name of Valerie Plame. So what limits do exist on the print media are imposed entirely by market forces and an audience, imposed entirely by the media's need to seek out eyeballs, to gain new viewers. That's it. If you are a print media outlet and you can cover the cost of running your print media outlet, or either through doing media-y things or through doing something else, you're allowed to print basically whatever you want for any reason, for as long as you can remain in operation. We have very, very little regulation in the United States on print media. Indeed, as I've mentioned before, our current president is very upset about this sort of thing. He's often expressed a desire to want to censor the news media or go after the news media for slander, for libel, basically for saying mean things about him, right? But in the United States, that is not part of our legal tradition. Right? That's print media. Broadcast media is different. So broadcast media are subject to government regulations because there is a limited amount of radio spectrum, right? There's only so much space in terms of radio waves. Everybody kind of... Okay. Brief divergence into radio geekery here for a second. Because I think this stuff is cool. Let's see. Here we go. So I think this stuff is cool, so you get to put up with me. This is the electromagnetic spectrum and its allocation in the United States. I don't need to go into huge detail on this, but you'll notice at the bottom of each of these slices is a frequency, right? 300 kilohertz, 3 megahertz, 30 megahertz, 300 megahertz. And so all of these numbers are frequencies. So all of these little boxes slice up the radio spectrum into a bunch of different pieces. Kind of a significant piece that you would be familiar with right here is AM broadcast, right? This is AM broadcast. It's like 600 to 1040 kilohertz. There's television channels here. Those are channels like 2, 3, and 4. Here, no, 2 and 3. Here's FM radio, right? So all of this stuff is divided up and allocated by the Federal Communications Commission, which is an agency that was set up, as I mentioned before, in the early days of radio to keep radio stations from bumping into each other. And so this is what they do. They slice up that spectrum. This is a natural resource that you're looking at here. It may be hard to conceptualize that, but there's only so much space out in the radio waves, out in the ether. And so this is a public resource. And just like the BLM manages our public land resources, the FCC manages our public radio spectrum resources. F11, make that go away, make that go away, make that definitely go away. Here we are. And so in order to operate anything that transmits onto the radio spectrum, you need to be authorized from the FCC to do that. In most cases, with a few exceptions, like, for example, Wi-Fi, you don't need a license for, but in most cases, you need an FCC license to operate a radio, operate anything that transmits radio waves. That especially goes for broadcasters. FCC licenses particular broadcast stations to solely occupy a given frequency. A piece of our common natural resources is licensed to a corporation, right? And so accordingly, FCC licensees are required to be socially responsible with that piece of our natural resources, our public commonwealth. So, for example, one of the things that you can still see on today, if you're watching, and particularly children's television or documentaries or things like that, you ever see that EI icon up in the corner? That stands for Educational Informational, and the FCC requires that TV stations broadcast a certain percentage of their programming as that is educational or informational. And they have to put that mark on there to say, this is the programming that I'm using to meet that requirement. Most of the time, it's like kids shows during the day, or documentaries very, very, very late at night. But stations are required to be socially responsible. A lot of TV news stations, news is a losing game for most television stations. They'd much rather close the TV studio and just beam everything to every corner of the country from New York City and be done with it. But the FCC requires that if you want to have a television broadcast station, you've got to have a news studio that produces local news. And they've been softening that requirement over the years as technology has changes. One particular regulation that used to be very, very important was the Fairness Doctrine, which was put into place in 1949, and basically said that if you're going to talk about politics on your media outlet, you need to talk about you need to give equal time to opposing perspectives on an issue. If you get a Democrat on your show to talk about politics for 10 minutes, you need to give the Republicans 10 minutes. And if you have a city council candidate come on, you need to give their opponent the chance to come on. If you have the proponent of one bill come on, you need to give their opponent of that bill the chance to come on. So all media outlets were required to give equal time to opposing political perspectives. The result of that was that, generally speaking, media outlets tried to avoid taking a political stance at all. They reported the news as apolitically as they possibly could, and and abided by the fairness doctrine where they had to, right? If you had to talk to a politician, then you also got their opposite number on. But technology has changed. And in 1983, the Reagan administration, always eager to cut government regulations, basically said that, look, cable TV exists. If people want to set up a news station that caters to a particular political perspective, well, they can do that. And there's enough space on cable TV. It's not as limited as the electromagnetic perspective, as the chart that I showed you earlier. This is kind of an oversimplification, but basically having a cable TV system creates your own little private electromagnetic spectrum that exists within that wire. And so instead of using all of those spaces on the spectrum for, well, this bit is for FM radio, and this bit is for airplanes, and this bit is for shipping, and this bit is for land mobile services, and this bit is for cell phones. No, you can just use all of that for television, which is why you can put 500 channels down cable TV, and you can't put them over the airwaves. And so Reagan basically said, look, people will support the media outlets that give them the perspective that they want. We don't need to regulate it. The market will do that for us. And that is an example of how media regulation has changed as technology has shifted over time. Okay. Another way that media regulation has shifted over time. Do I still have my web browser up? Yes, good. Another way that media regulation has shifted over time is that we used to protect competition. We used to protect media companies against over-consolidation and monopoly. We used to have requirements where you could only own a certain number of radio licenses, a certain number of TV licenses in any given city, and you're only able to own licenses, a certain number of licenses overall. So most television stations in the United States operate on something like a franchise model. If you live in the biggest cities, some of those are directly operated. So like ABC 7 in Los Angeles is a directly operated ABC station, but ABC was only allowed to have, back in the day, they were only allowed to have 12 licenses for 12 stations across the entire country. So they put them in the biggest markets, right? So LA, New York, Chicago. And if you live somewhere like Las Vegas, you probably got your news through what's known as an affiliate, which is basically like a franchisee of those big media corporations. All of our network TV stations here in Las Vegas are affiliates. None of them are owned by NBC, ABC, or CBS, right? That is a result of FCC regulations that prevented media companies from consolidating too much of the market. But the Telecom Act of 1996 led to a significant scaling back of that requirement, permitting companies to own far more media outlets and reducing or entirely removing limits on how many media outlets one company could own. Companies could own outlets in multiple media markets all over the country, and that is, by the way, why FM radio sucks. If you noticed FM radio sucks lately, FM radio sucks. It all sounds the same. It's all the same, like 10 songs over and over again. And a big reason for that is because it's all owned by a couple of big companies like Clear Channel and iHeartRadio. They bought up a bunch of FM radio stations all over the country, and they basically play the same catalog in every city in America with remote DJs, and it's very cheap to operate, and then they sell ad space, and that is how FM radio stays on the air. It also, though, produces more worrying effects when we talk about the news media. I don't have that chart. Screw you guys. So this, pardon, just a moment. This video here, and do let me know if you can't hear it, but this video here was a script that had to be read on every single station owned by a broadcaster that you probably never heard of, a company called Sinclair Broadcasting. Because of the consolidation in our media, because the FCC has got rid of all these limits on media consolidation, we have seen in local media these companies coming in and buying up local TV stations all over the country, to the point that a Sinclair TV station is in something like 65 or 70% of American homes. We do have one here in Las Vegas. It is the NBC affiliate, which I think is channel 3. NBC Las Vegas. That is News 3 Las Vegas. Yes, at KSNV. Anyway, so just take a look at this. I think you get the point. So anyway, that consolidation is not just... so Sinclair is this very arch-conservative company that basically had their media anchors read this script about, about fake and biased news in the media, basically attacking their own institutions. Some reporters quit rather than read this script. Should also mention that media consolidation is not just a local media phenomenon, though. Something like 6 companies actually own pretty much everything that you see, watch, read, or listen. They are, I can't remember what the 6 of them are, but Disney is one of them. Did you know that Disney owns ABC and ESPN at this point? NBC Universal, which is Comcast, Viacom is a big one. So there's about six companies that own 90% of the American media market. And that's becoming more and more and more and more and more consolidated. So increasingly, all that media that you've been binging the last few days is coming from the same sources. And that can significantly limit the sort of viewpoints, the sort of politics that we see presented in our media system. Okay, could not hear the video. Damn. I'm going to go ahead and post a link up to that video here in the chat, and I will post it in the description for people watching later. So, and I will fix my streaming setup so that next time that does not happen. This is the first time I'm doing this, so but here is the link so that you all can see. It is very jarring to watch. So let's see. Consolidation. Media consolidation threatens to dominate the market and push out voices that aren't, extraordinarily well funded and and supported by, Disney or Comcast, or if you're Jeff Bezos, you can buy your own newspaper, but that's about it, right? And so that is actually significantly threatening our political discourse. That's where I'm going to cut it today. Does anyone have any questions about anything before I sign off? Gonna hold here for about a minute so people can get their typing in. No questions? Awesome. All right, folks. It looks like everything. If you do have a question, go ahead and shoot it to me on Canvas Messenger. I will keep you updated on the status of the quizzes, but they are not going to be held before the date. So we will finish Chapter 9 Thursday. Yes, we're going to finish Chapter 9 tomorrow morning and probably go on to Chapter 10, because there's about an hour worth of conversation left in Chapter 9. Anyone else? No? Okay, so yeah, next live stream is going to be tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. So hopefully my Tuesday, Thursday students, that's a little more convenient for them. If you can't make that, again, this will be recorded and posted right here on this YouTube account, so that you can catch up. Quizzes, as I said, I don't have the dates set, but I will make sure that they are not before the dates set out in the media. And I promise, excuse me, not in the media. God, too much talking about the media. It won't be before the date in the syllabus, and you will have at least like a week to take them. So any further questions, you can send to me on Canvas. I'm going to go try and find some toilet paper out there somewhere. I hope you all stay safe, stay sane, stay streaming, I guess, and that we get through this. I will see you all tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.